The wind howled through the empty streets of Greystone Hollow, a village forgotten by time and ignored by progress. Snow blanketed the rooftops, muffling the eerie silence. It was December 31st, and the villagers prepared for their annual New Year's feast. They moved with quiet efficiency, their faces pale and grim as they hung garlands of human bones over their doors and painted cryptic symbols on their windows with blood. The wind howled through the empty streets of Greystone Hollow, a village forgotten by time and ignored by progress. Snow blanketed the rooftops, muffling the eerie silence. It was December 31st, and the villagers prepared for their annual New Year's feast. They moved with quiet efficiency, their faces pale and grim as they hung garlands of human bones over their doors and painted cryptic symbols on their windows with blood. Sarah and her brother Michael had been stranded in the village for nearly 2 weeks. Their car had broken down on their way to visit family for Christmas, and they had sought shelter in the hollow, where the townsfolk offered them a warm bed and vague reassurances that help would arrive soon. But no help came. Their phones had no signal, and every time they asked about the outside world, the villagers changed the subject. Now, trapped by a blizzard and unable to leave, Sarah and Michael sat in the drafty inn, watching snow swirl outside. The fire in the hearth sputtered weakly, and the shadows in the room stretched long and thin. "Something's wrong with this place," Sarah whispered. Michael nodded. "We should have left the moment we got here." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Edith, the innkeeper, her gaunt face illuminated by a flickering lantern. "You're invited to the feast," she said, her voice raspy. "We'll pass," Michael said quickly. Edith frowned. "That's not an option, dear. Everyone must attend. Father demands it." The town square was an unsettling sight. A long banquet table stretched across the clearing, piled high with steaming dishes. At first glance it looked inviting, roast meats, pies and golden loaves of bread. But the smell was rancid, a sickly sweet stench that turned Sarah's stomach. The villagers sat quietly, their eyes downcast. In the center of the table stood an enormous figure draped in a crimson cloak, its face obscured by a hood. Chains hung from its shoulders, clinking softly with every movement. "That's Father," Edith whispered to Sarah. "Who is he?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling.
Edith didn't answer. Instead, she took her place at the table and gestured for Sarah and Michael to sit. The feast began with a low, guttural chant from the villagers. They sang in a language Sarah didn't recognize, their voices rising and falling like a dirge. The figure in red stood motionless at the head of the table, its presence oppressive and cold. A plate was placed in front of Sarah, raw meat, still bleeding. Her stomach churned as she pushed it away. "You must eat," Edith hissed. "Father is watching." Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the frozen ground. "This is insane. We're leaving." The villagers stopped chanting. The figure in red turned its hooded head toward Michael, and the air seemed to freeze. "You will sit," a voice rumbled from beneath the hood, deep and hollow. Michael glared at the figure, or what? The chains on the figure rattled. Slowly it raised a massive hand, its fingers tipped with claws like icicles. Sarah grabbed Michael's arm. "Please, just sit." Reluctantly, he did. "Bring forth the offering," Edith said, her voice trembling. 2 villagers dragged a struggling man into the square. His face was bruised, and his wrists were bound with barbed wire. He screamed, begging for mercy, but the villagers ignored him. The figure in red stepped forward, towering over the man. It reached out with its clawed hand, gripping the man's head. There was a sickening crunch as the figure twisted, tearing the man's skull from his body. Blood sprayed across the snow, steaming in the cold. Sarah screamed, clapping a hand over her mouth. Michael stood, but Edith grabbed his arm. "You can't leave," she whispered. "Father won't allow it." That night, Sarah and Michael barricaded themselves in their room at the inn. The image of the man's mutilated body haunted them, his blood staining the snow like a grisly canvas. "We have to get out of here," Michael said, pacing. "How?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "The storm is too strong and they'll come for us." Michael didn't answer. Instead, he began searching the room, looking for anything they could use as a weapon. At midnight, the knocking began. "Time to join the procession," Edith called from the other side of the door. Michael held a fireplace poker, his knuckles white. "We're not going anywhere." The door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. The wood splintered, and Sarah screamed as the villagers poured in, their faces twisted with fanatic glee. They dragged Sarah and Michael into the streets, where the figure in red waited. The villagers formed a circle around the siblings, chanting once more. The figure in red stepped forward, its hood falling back to reveal a face that defied comprehension. Its skin was translucent, its eyes burning embers in hollow sockets. Its mouth was a gaping maw, filled with jagged teeth that dripped with black ichor. 2 offerings, it rumbled. 2 souls for the new year. The villagers cheered. Sarah sobbed as the creature reached for her, its claws grazing her skin. "Wait!" Michael shouted. "Take me! Just let her go!" The creature paused, tilting its grotesque head. "You offer yourself freely?" Michael nodded, tears streaming down his face. The creature let out a bone-rattling laugh. "Very well." It grabbed Michael, lifting him effortlessly. His screams echoed through the hollow as the creature tore him apart, its claws shredding flesh and bone. Blood rained down, staining the villagers, who reveled in the carnage. Chunks of Michael's organs were tossed into the air, and the villagers scrambled to catch the dripping pieces, shoving them into their mouths with manic delight. His severed arm was thrown into the snow, where Edith grabbed it and began gnawing on the flesh, blood running down her chin. Sarah collapsed to the ground, trembling. When it was over, the creature turned to Sarah. "You are spared, for now." It disappeared into the shadows, its chains rattling. The villagers dispersed, their duty fulfilled. Edith helped Sarah to her feet, her expression unreadable. "You'll stay here now," she said. "You'll learn our ways. Next year you'll help choose the offering." Sarah stared at her, numb. "Never." Edith smiled faintly. "You'll see. In time you'll understand." Months later, when spring arrived, travelers passing through Greystone Hollow noticed a new garland hanging above the inn's door. It was made of bones gleaming white in the sunlight, and in the center, strung on a crimson ribbon, was a single human skull. The town of Wintershade had always been strange. Perched on the edge of a dark forest, it was shrouded in perpetual gloom even during the brightest days. But at Christmas time, it came alive with garlands of evergreen, sparkling lights, and wreaths adorning every door. The villagers took great pride in their wreaths, though outsiders often found them unsettling. The berries were too red, the leaves too dark, and the wreaths gave off an odd, metallic smell. None of this bothered Lila and her boyfriend Adam as they drove into town on Christmas Eve. Their car had skidded off the icy road nearby, and the villagers had eagerly welcomed them, offering shelter in a quaint cottage. Lila found the people polite but unnervingly intense, their gazes lingering just a second too long, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. By Christmas morning, the storm outside had worsened, trapping them in Wintershade. Adam, ever the optimist, suggested they make the best of it. "It's cozy here," he said, gesturing to the roaring fireplace and the smell of mulled wine in the air. Lila, however, felt uneasy. The villagers seemed too interested in their arrival, and their questions were invasive. "Do you have family expecting you? Does anyone know you're here?" It felt like they were sizing them up. That evening, the village mayor, a wiry man named Elias, invited them to the annual wreath lighting ceremony. "It's a tradition," he said, his smile toothy and sharp. "You must come. It's our gift to the new year." Reluctantly, they agreed. The ceremony took place in the village square. A towering pine stood at its center, adorned with ornaments that glittered like wet stones. Beneath it hung an enormous wreath, its leaves dark and waxy, its red berries glistening in the torchlight. The villagers gathered, dressed in heavy cloaks, their faces obscured by hoods. As Elias began to chant, the wreath seemed to move, its berries quivering as though alive. Lila clutched Adam's arm. "I don't like this," she whispered. Adam nodded, his expression grim. The chanting grew louder, a guttural, rhythmic sound that resonated in Lila's chest. The air grew thick with an iron tang, and the wreath began to drip. At first, Lila thought it was melted snow, but the liquid was too dark, too viscous. Blood. Suddenly, the berries burst open, revealing dozens of tiny, lidless eyes. The villagers fell to their knees, their chants turning to wails. Elias stepped forward, raising his arms. "Tonight, the old year dies, and the new year is born. The wreath demands sacrifice." The villagers turned toward Lila and Adam. Panic surged through Lila as hands grabbed her, pulling her toward the tree. Adam fought, swinging wildly, but there were too many of them. Lila screamed as she was dragged beneath the wreath. The eyes on the berries swiveled to focus on her, and a long, thorny vine snaked down, wrapping around her wrist. It was warm, pulsing like a heartbeat. Adam broke free, grabbing a torch from the ground. "Let her go!" he shouted, swinging it at the villagers. The flames forced them back, their hooded faces hissing as though burned by the light. Adam reached Lila, slashing at the vine with the torch. The wreath let out an unearthly screech, its berries exploding in a spray of blood and ichor. The villagers howled, their voices blending into a deafening cacophony. Another vine shot out, this one wrapping around Adam's leg. It pulled him upward, dangling him in front of the wreath. "The wreath must feed!" Elias shouted. "Only then will the new year come!" The vine tightened, cutting into Adam's flesh. Blood poured down, soaking the snow. The wreath quivered, its leaves shimmering with life as it absorbed the sacrifice. "No!" Lila screamed. Grabbing the torch, she lunged at the wreath, plunging the flames into its center. The wreath writhed, its vines thrashing wildly. The villagers screamed, clutching their heads as the wreath burned, the fire consuming its grotesque form. Adam fell to the ground, blood pooling around him. Lila dragged him away from the inferno, her heart pounding. Behind them, the villagers wailed, their bodies convulsing. As the wreath turned to ash, they collapsed, lifeless. The storm broke just as dawn arrived. Lila and Adam limped back to their car, their bodies battered and bloodied. As they drove away, the village of Wintershade vanished behind them, leaving only an empty stretch of snow-covered forest. Weeks later, when Lila and Adam finally felt safe, they returned home. But something wasn't right. Every night, Lila dreamed of the wreath, its eyes watching her, its vines reaching out. One evening, she noticed a package on their doorstep. Inside was a small wreath, its leaves dark and waxy, its berries glistening red. That night, the eyes opened. In the small mountain town of Frosthaven, the holiday season came with a peculiar tradition, the 12 Nights of Giving. Each evening, starting on Christmas Eve and ending on January 5th, the villagers gathered at the town square to leave offerings beneath the towering evergreen tree that dominated the center. The gifts weren't toys or food, but strange, macabre tokens, severed animal heads, jars of blackened teeth, and bundles of feathers matted with blood. Outsiders never stayed long enough to understand why. Ellie and her younger brother Nathan didn't have a choice. Their car had broken down on the snowy road leading out of town, and with no cell service and no way to hike back in the blizzard, they'd been forced to take refuge in the inn. The innkeeper, an elderly woman named Mabel, had been kind enough at first, but her gaze lingered too long, her smiles too sharp. "You're just in time for the last few nights of the festival," she'd said, placing 2 steaming mugs of cider before them. "You'll find it memorable." Ellie had a bad feeling from the start. The villagers seemed overly curious about them, their questions invasive. What brings you here? Does anyone know where you are? Family nearby? When they attended the Christmas Eve ceremony, she noticed their strange, almost reverent expressions as they placed their gruesome offerings beneath the tree. She also noticed the smell of decay that clung to the air, even as fresh snow fell. Nathan, only 17, brushed off her concerns. "They're just weird locals," he said. "It's probably some old custom." But by the 5th night, Ellie knew it was more than that. They had been invited to participate in the festival's offerings. Mabel handed them a burlap sack, wriggling with movement. "A token for the tree," she said, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Nathan, too polite to argue, opened the sack to find a rabbit, its eyes wide with terror. Before Ellie could protest, a villager took the rabbit and slit its throat, letting the blood drip onto the snow before tossing the carcass onto the growing pile of gore beneath the tree. Ellie gagged, dragging Nathan away. "This isn't normal," she whispered. "We need to leave. Now!" That night, they tried to sneak out of the inn, but as they reached the door, Mabel was waiting, her face shadowed and severe. "Leaving before the 12th night is forbidden," she hissed. "The giving must be completed." When Nathan protested, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her nails digging into his skin. "The tree watches. The tree knows. You don't want to anger it." The next morning, Ellie woke to find Nathan missing. Panic set in as she searched the inn, then the streets. The villagers ignored her pleas for help, their faces blank, their eyes distant. As night fell, she ran to the town square, hoping to find him. The tree loomed over the snow-covered ground, its branches creaking ominously in the wind. Beneath it lay the mound of offerings, now larger than ever. And then she saw him. Nathan was tied to the trunk, his eyes wide with terror, his mouth gagged with a strip of cloth. His face was streaked with tears, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Before Ellie could reach him, the villagers emerged, surrounding the tree in a silent circle. Mabel stepped forward, holding a ceremonial dagger, its blade glinting in the torchlight. "The tree demands blood," Mabel intoned. "Tonight we honor the old pact." "No!" Ellie screamed, rushing toward them. But rough hands grabbed her, pulling her back. She thrashed and kicked, her cries drowned out by the villagers chanting. Mabel raised the dagger, her expression one of solemn devotion. Nathan's muffled screams filled the air as Mabel plunged the blade into his chest. Blood sprayed across the snow, steaming in the frigid air. The tree groaned, its branches twisting as if in ecstasy. The ground beneath it pulsed, and Ellie saw something moving, roots slithering like snakes, soaking up the crimson pool spreading around Nathan's body. The villagers cheered, their voices echoing through the night. Mabel stepped back, her hands dripping with blood, as the tree's bark split open to reveal a grotesque face. Its hollow eyes glowed red, and its mouth stretched into a jagged grin. "The pact is honored," the tree rumbled, its voice deep and wet. "The new year begins. New..." Ellie's captors released her, and she collapsed to the ground, sobbing. The villagers dispersed, their duty complete. Nathan's lifeless body hung limply against the trunk, his blood still dripping into the snow. But it wasn't over. The tree shifted, its roots tearing free from the earth. It began to move, dragging itself toward Ellie with a sickening creak of wood and bone. "You," it growled. "You are next." Ellie scrambled to her feet, running blindly through the snow. Behind her, she heard the tree's heavy movements, its roots tearing through the frozen ground. She stumbled, falling face first into the snow, and turned to see its gnarled branches reaching for her. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed a nearby torch and swung it at the branches. The flames caught and the tree let out a deafening roar, its wooden flesh cracking and popping as it burned. The villagers screamed, their faces contorted with rage and fear. "The pact!" Mabel shrieked. "You've doomed us all!" The fire spread quickly, consuming the tree and the offerings beneath it. The villagers fled as the flames illuminated the night, casting grotesque shadows against the snow. Ellie ran, her body trembling, her mind racing. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the forest, where the wreck of her car still sat. Days later, when she finally found her way back to civilization, no one believed her story. The authorities found no trace of Frosthaven. The road she described led only to an unbroken expanse of wilderness. But every Christmas Eve, Ellie dreams of the tree. She hears its groaning branches, smells the iron tang of blood in the air, and in her dreams it whispers to her, its voice cold and hungry. The pact was broken. You will pay. The Frost Parish. The blizzard started the night before Christmas Eve, blanketing the isolated town of Coldspire in a suffocating white haze. Abby and her husband Mark had been driving through the mountains on their way to visit family when their car skidded on black ice and landed in a snowbank. With no way to dig the vehicle out and no cell service, they decided to hike toward the faint glow of lights they'd seen through the trees. When they arrived in Coldspire, the town looked idyllic at first glance. Christmas lights sparkled on rooftops, wreaths adorned every door, and a large tree stood proudly in the town square. The snow-coated streets were lined with quaint cottages, and smoke curled invitingly from their chimneys. But something felt off. The villagers greeted Abby and Mark warmly, yet their eyes were hollow, their smiles strained. The town itself was eerily quiet, and the chill in the air felt unnatural, biting through their coats no matter how many layers they wore. "You're just in time for the midnight mass," said a wiry woman named Judith, who had offered them a room in her home. "It's the most important tradition of the season." "We're not religious," Abby replied, but Judith waved her off with a crooked smile. "It's not about faith, it's about honoring the Frost Father and welcoming the new year." That night, Abby awoke to the sound of bells echoing through the streets. She glanced at the clock, 11:45 p.m. Mark stirred beside her, muttering in his sleep. She shook him awake. "Something's happening," she whispered. They peered out the window to see the villagers, cloaked in heavy robes, walking in a solemn procession toward the church at the center of town. Each person carried a candle, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. Against her better judgment, Abby convinced Mark they should follow. Inside the church, the air was thick with the smell of wax and pine. The villagers knelt in the pews, their heads bowed. At the altar stood a man in ornate robes, his face obscured by a mask carved from ice. Behind him, the massive stained glass window depicted a figure wreathed in frost, its skeletal hands outstretched. "The Frost Father watches," the masked man intoned, his voice echoing unnaturally. "And tonight, we offer him our gifts." Judith appeared beside Abby and Mark, her hand cold and bony as it gripped Abby's arm. "You're guests in our parish," she said softly. "It's only right you offer something too." "What kind of gifts?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. Judith's smile widened, revealing teeth as sharp as icicles. "Blood, of course." Before they could react, two villagers grabbed Mark, dragging him toward the altar. Abby screamed, trying to pull him back, but Judith held her in place with inhuman strength. Mark thrashed as the masked man raised a long, curved knife, its blade glinting in the candlelight. "Frost Father, accept this gift," the man chanted. "No!" Abby shrieked, breaking free from Judith and rushing toward the altar. She grabbed a candelabra and swung it at the masked man, knocking the blade from his hand. The villagers gasped, their murmurs filling the air like the rustle of dead leaves. The stained glass window behind the altar began to glow, the frost-covered figure within coming to life. The glass shattered, and a bone-chilling wind howled through the church as the Frost Father emerged. Its body was made of jagged ice and gnarled wood, its hollow eyes burning with blue fire. "You have interrupted the ritual," it hissed, its voice a crackling avalanche. "And now you must take his place." Abby grabbed Mark's hand and they ran, pushing through the panicked villagers as the Frost Father's icy tendrils lashed out, freezing anything they touched. Outside, the storm had worsened, the snow blinding and relentless. They stumbled through the streets, their breaths freezing in their throats. The Frost Father pursued them, its massive form looming in the distance. Its voice echoed through the storm. "There is no escape. Your blood will sanctify the new year." They reached Judith's house and barricaded the door, but the temperature inside plummeted. Frost spread across the walls, and the windows cracked under the pressure of the freezing wind. "We have to burn it," Abby said suddenly, her mind racing. "The tree in the square, that's where its power comes from." Mark nodded, his face pale with fear. Together they gathered what little fuel they could find, lantern oil, candles, anything flammable, and made their way to the square. The Frost Father stood between them and the massive tree, its form shimmering in the darkness. "You will not defile my altar!" it roared, its tendrils snapping toward them. Mark lit a torch and hurled it at the tree. The flames caught instantly, climbing the branches and consuming the ornaments. The Frost Father screamed, its icy body cracking and splintering as the fire spread. The villagers emerged from their homes, watching in horror as their god burned. When the tree collapsed in a fiery heap, the Frost Father shattered into 1,000 pieces, its shards melting into the snow. The villagers fell to their knees, weeping. Abby and Mark didn't wait to see what happened next. They fled into the forest, following the faint outline of the road until they finally found help. Months later, the snow melted and Coldspire was never seen on a map again. But on the first cold night of December, Abby found a shard of jagged ice on her windowsill, its surface etched with words, "The Frost Father remembers." In the desolate town of Hollow Pines, Christmas was a time of fear, not joy. The locals whispered stories about the Red Saint, a twisted version of Santa Claus who came not to deliver gifts, but to collect blood. It was said that every year he claimed a family to drag back to his icy lair where they'd never be seen again. Outsiders rarely heard these tales, but Amanda and her younger brother Jake were about to learn the hard way. Their car broke down during a holiday road trip, leaving them stranded in Hollow Pines on Christmas Eve. The townsfolk were unusually kind, offering them shelter and warm meals. They insisted the siblings stay in the old inn at the edge of town, a place with creaking floors, frosted windows, and the suffocating smell of pine sap. The innkeeper, an elderly man named Walter, warned them, "Stay inside tonight. No matter what you hear, don't open the door. If you see him, it's already too late." Amanda laughed nervously, thinking it was some small-town superstition. Jake, however, was visibly shaken. That night, the snow fell heavier than Amanda had ever seen. The wind howled like a living creature, rattling the windows. Jake sat by the fire, nervously biting his nails. "Do you think it's true? About the Red Saint?" he asked. Amanda shook her head. "It's just a story to scare kids. Get some sleep." Midnight struck, and with it came a sound that froze Amanda's blood. A low, guttural scraping noise, like claws dragging across wood. Jake bolted upright. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Amanda tried to dismiss it, but then came the second noise, a deep, rumbling laugh that echoed through the room. "Ho, ho, ho," it boomed, but there was no joy in it, only malice. The lights flickered, then went out. The room plunged into darkness, and Amanda's breath came in quick gasps. A loud thud reverberated from the hallway, followed by the sound of heavy boots crunching on the wooden floor. "He's here," Jake whimpered, clutching Amanda's arm. The door burst open, revealing a hulking figure clad in a tattered red coat. His face was obscured by a mask of human skin stretched grotesquely into a grin, the eye holes revealing two glowing red orbs. His beard was matted with blood, and his hands ended in claw-like fingers dripping with crimson. In one hand, he held a rusty sack that writhed as though something inside it was alive. Before Amanda could react, the Red Saint lunged forward, grabbing Jake by the neck and lifting him off the ground. Amanda screamed, throwing herself at the monster, but he swatted her away like a rag doll. Jake thrashed in his grip, choking as the claws tightened. "Good little boy," the Red Saint growled, his voice a harsh rasp. "You've been chosen." He opened the sack, and Amanda caught a glimpse of its contents, severed limbs, eyeless heads, and wriggling torsos that moaned faintly, as if still alive. Amanda grabbed a fireplace poker and swung it at the Red Saint, the sharp end slicing into his shoulder. He howled in pain, dropping Jake, who crumpled to the floor. The monster turned to Amanda, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Naughty girl," he snarled. "You'll go first." He swung his sack, knocking Amanda into the fireplace. Her head slammed against the bricks, and black spots danced in her vision. She felt the heat of the flames licking at her back as the Red Saint loomed over her, raising his claws. But Jake, barely conscious, crawled to the poker and thrust it into the creature's leg. The Red Saint bellowed, black blood gushing from the wound. He stumbled, and Amanda seized the moment, grabbing a shard of broken glass from the floor and driving it into his neck. The monster reeled, clawing at the glass, his blood spraying across the room in thick, steaming jets. "You'll pay for this," he hissed, his voice gurgling as blood filled his throat. He stumbled backward, crashing through the window and into the snow. Amanda and Jake didn't wait to see if he was dead. They fled into the blizzard, their breath visible in the freezing air. The snowstorm was relentless, and they could barely see a few feet ahead. Behind them, the Red Saint's laughter echoed faintly. "You can't run, you can't hide." They reached the church at the center of town, its doors ajar, candles flickering inside. Desperate, they ran inside and slammed the doors shut. The villagers were there, gathered in a circle, their faces solemn. Walter stepped forward, holding a large silver blade. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked. Amanda nodded, her body trembling. "You didn't stay inside. You've brought him here." "What are you talking about?" Jake demanded. Walter's expression darkened. "The Red Saint doesn't come without invitation. You broke the rules, and now we all pay." Suddenly the doors flew open and the Red Saint stormed in, his wounds already healing. The villagers screamed, but Walter raised the blade and charged. The monster swatted him aside, snapping his spine with a sickening crunch. What followed was a massacre. The Red Saint tore through the villagers, ripping limbs from bodies, spilling intestines onto the floor. Blood painted the walls as screams filled the church. Amanda and Jake crouched behind the altar, frozen in terror as the monster feasted on the carnage. As the Red Saint consumed the last villager, he turned toward the siblings, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Time for the final gifts," he growled, advancing slowly. Amanda grabbed the silver blade from Walter's lifeless hand. She stood, her legs shaking, and faced the creature. "You want to fight? Come get me!" The Red Saint roared, charging at her. At the last second she sidestepped, driving the blade into his chest. The monster howled, his body convulsing as the silver burned him from the inside out. Amanda twisted the blade, and the Red Saint erupted into flames, his screams shaking the church. When the fire finally died, all that remained was ash and the faint smell of pine. Amanda and Jake stumbled out into the snow, their clothes soaked in blood. The storm had stopped, and the first light of Christmas morning glimmered on the horizon. As they reached the edge of town, Amanda looked back. The church was gone. The inn was gone. Hollow Pines was nothing but an empty, snow-covered field. But in the distance, she thought she heard a low, guttural laugh. Snow fell thick and heavy over the isolated town of Black Hollow, burying rooftops and muffling the distant howls of the wind. It was Christmas Eve, and the town square was alive with festivities. A towering tree adorned with crimson ribbons, wreaths of holly strung across storefronts, and the smell of roasted chestnuts wafting through the icy air. But beneath the cheer lay an undercurrent of unease. Black Hollow had a tradition, one that outsiders didn't know until it was far too late. The midnight feast wasn't a banquet for the townsfolk, it was for him. Amanda and her fiancé Luke had taken a wrong turn on the way to her parents' Christmas gathering. Their car sputtered to a halt just as they passed the town's welcome sign. With no cell service and no sign of traffic, they decided to walk toward the lights flickering in the distance. The townsfolk greeted them with forced smiles and curious stares. "You're just in time," said an elderly man with glassy eyes. "Stay for the feast." They were ushered into the town hall, a grand yet crumbling structure with faded banners and an oppressive air. Long tables stretched across the room, laden with steaming dishes, roasted meats, glazed vegetables, and pies that gleamed under the candlelight. The townsfolk took their seats, leaving the two outsiders at the head of the table. "An honor," the mayor said, raising a toast. His voice was warm, but his smile never reached his eyes. Amanda leaned toward Luke, whispering, "Something's not right." But before he could respond, the lights dimmed. A bell tolled 12 times, each chime reverberating through the hall. The villagers fell silent, their heads bowing in unison. The mayor stood, his expression grave. "It is time to honor the old hunger," he said, his voice echoing. "And tonight we welcome new guests to the tradition." The double doors creaked open and an icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing half the candles. Amanda's breath caught in her throat as a figure entered, a towering, emaciated creature draped in tattered robes. Its face was a grotesque mask of bone and rotting flesh, its eyes hollow pits that seemed to swallow the light. Its skeletal hands dragged behind it a massive rusted cauldron, the iron scraping against the wooden floor. The old hunger stopped at the head of the table, its eyeless gaze fixed on Amanda and Luke. The mayor stepped forward, holding a ceremonial dagger. "The feast begins with the sacrifice," he said, offering the blade to the creature. Before Amanda could react, 2 villagers seized Luke, dragging him to the center of the hall. He screamed, struggling against their grip. "What are you doing?" Amanda shrieked, leaping to her feet. The mayor's expression hardened. "Be silent, girl. Your role comes next." The old hunger raised a spindly hand and the villagers fell still. It took the dagger, its claws curling around the hilt. Luke's screams grew frantic as the creature loomed over him, its rotten breath filling the air with the stench of decay. With a swift motion, it plunged the blade into his chest. Blood spurted across the table, staining the white tablecloth a deep crimson. Amanda screamed as the creature carved into Luke's torso with horrifying precision, pulling out his organs and dropping them into the cauldron. The villagers began to chant, their voices low and guttural, a language Amanda couldn't understand. The cauldron bubbled, emitting a foul steam that filled the hall. Amanda broke free from her shock and lunged toward the creature, grabbing a chair and swinging it with all her strength. The wood shattered against its back, but the old hunger didn't flinch. It turned to her, its hollow eyes narrowing. "You," it rasped, its voice like the grinding of stone. "You are next." The villagers swarmed her, their hands clawing at her clothes and hair. She fought, biting and kicking, but they dragged her to the table and forced her down. The mayor approached, holding the bloody dagger. "Your sacrifice will ensure our survival," he said. Amanda's mind raced. She spotted a candelabra within reach and grabbed it, swinging it into the mayor's face. He stumbled back with a scream, his nose shattered. She didn't hesitate. She snatched the dagger from his hands and drove it into the throat of the nearest villager. Blood sprayed across her face, warm and metallic. The hall descended into chaos. The villagers screamed and scattered as Amanda slashed her way toward the door. The old hunger roared, its skeletal frame bending unnaturally as it pursued her. She grabbed a bottle of lamp oil from one of the tables and hurled it at the creature, dousing it in the flammable liquid. With trembling hands, she lit a match and tossed it. Flames erupted, consuming the old hunger in a blaze of orange and black. It shrieked, its flesh melting away to reveal a twisted skeleton. The villagers fell to their knees, wailing as their god burned. Amanda didn't stop to see the aftermath. She stumbled out into the snow, blood dripping from her hands and soaking her clothes. The town square was eerily silent, the towering Christmas tree swaying in the wind. She collapsed against a lamppost, gasping for breath, but the silence didn't last. Behind her, she heard the faint scrape of metal against stone. She turned, her heart plummeting. The old hunger emerged from the flames, its charred form reassembling itself. It was smaller now, weaker, but its hollow eyes burned with fury. "You cannot escape," it rasped. "The feast must continue." Amanda ran, her boots crunching through the snow. She reached the edge of town where her broken car still sat. She climbed inside, slamming the door behind her, and fumbled with the keys. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. In the rearview mirror, she saw the old hunger standing in the distance, its bony hand raised in a silent promise. She didn't look back as she sped away, the snow swallowing the road ahead. Amanda never told anyone what happened in Black Hollow, but every Christmas Eve she hears the tolling of a bell in the distance and smells the faint scent of roasting meat. And she knows the old hunger is still waiting.